Welcome to Football Never Sleeps, the aspiring to be viral, caffeine-loaded, musically themed, NIL deficient weekly YouTube show all about Notre Dame football and the off-season news cycle that keeps burping up new and fun storylines. I'm Eric Hansen in South Bend and so far not in demand to be the general manager of any college football program. He's Tyler James, thawing out in LaPorte and back in the weeds with ND football recruiting as it heats up. Together, we're the content creators and anti-aggregators at InsideNDSports.com. On tonight's show, you asked for it, we're ready to deliver a verbal and visual look at what the Notre Dame football depth chart should look like when spring practice kicks off in 3 weeks, which position groups are the strongest and weakest at the outset, and which position battles will likely drag into fall camp. Those aren't rhetorical questions. We won't leave you hanging. We'll be taking and answering your questions, so buckle up and hit the cue. This is... Got a little long-winded.
That's all right. I would. You can blame the different intro countdown music.
That threw me.
It threw me too.
I was hypnotized.
That's just the default setting, apparently. The new default setting for the software that we use for our live stream. So I was like, wait a minute, did I press the wrong button? But hopefully that didn't throw anyone else off. We appreciate everyone here that is live with us tonight. We appreciate you guys for keeping the chat lively every week. For the uninitiated, make sure you're subscribed to us here on our YouTube channel, which only costs you a click. That allows you to get questions in during the show and puts our content into your feed on YouTube whenever we post a video. We'd also like for you to join us over at InsideNDSports.com, where you get access to our premium analysis and recruiting coverage and special access to us over on the Insider Lounge and our great community where we share our inside information first. You can try us out over there with a 30-day free trial using promo code NDYT. There's a link to this to that sign up in the video description below. And if you bear with me tonight, we're going to add some razzle dazzle. I don't know that it's very much razzle dazzle, but a little bit more visual accompaniment to what we're doing by popular demand. Like Eric hinted at, we published a depth chart projection for the start of Notre Dame's spring practices over on InsideNDSports.com. Practice starts March 18th. I'll have Eric sort of guide us through it with the caveats that he had when creating the depth chart, and then we'll go position by position and highlight some of the tough decisions that we made. And then we'll circle back into some of your questions and some more topics. I wanted to give a special shout out to Chris W. for providing the inspiration and asking for some depth chart guidance for this upcoming season. So let me do what I have to do here to get this set up, and we'll get rolling here. So bear with me.
Okay, while you're talking, I'll tell them a couple of things. So one thing is, we gave away a Dump Davy sticker to Rajon, and I received a beautiful handwritten thank you note from Rajon. It's enough that your parents named you Rajon and that it's the coolest name ever. But going back to the Tribune and getting some boxes of stuff of mine that have been sitting there for 3 years that Cheryl Morey wouldn't let anybody throw away. I have a second Dump Davy bumper sticker. There's a guy named Olivier in Quebec. Olivier, if you're watching, send me an email. If not, we're giving this away next week. And then I have something to share during when we go to the offensive line depth chart. A cool thing that Harry Heastan had mailed me when he was the offensive line coach with the Bears and overheard me say something on the radio.
All right. And while Eric was filling there for me, I got everything set up. So now this is not exactly what it looks like over at InsideNDSports.com. But this is, I sort of pulled the different position groups and put them into a PDF so we could display them here for us, Eric.
Okay. Do you want me to do the caveats here? About
so explain how you sort of went about it to start.
So we thought, do we want to do it what it looks like at the beginning or the end of spring? And we thought at this point, let's let them see what the beginning looks like, and we can all kind of do maybe on a future show guesswork on how we think these will end up. but we wanted to make it as accurate as possible. So in this one, you see Jordan Faison is at the bottom of the depth chart. That's not where he's either going to start or end up, but he's playing lacrosse full time. So this is not somebody that's going to factor in. We also put at the bottom of the depth chart players that we knew were out for spring football that were not going to be able to participate. Also, the guys that aren't arriving until June, there's about half the freshman class, and there's two grad transfers or two transfers that won't be here this spring. So we put them at the bottom to kind of maybe more reflect what we're going to see in the spring. And then in general, I put the incoming freshmen at the bottom. There are a few exceptions. The 4 guys that were here in December that were the uber early freshman enrollees, I would allow a little bit of play in them not being at the very bottom of the depth chart. So those are the caveats.
All right. And yeah, so each of these are sort of broken down by position group, and then further within the different various positions. So right here, we're looking at receivers with field receiver, boundary receiver, and slot receiver. I think the thing that was maybe the most curious to me, or I'm most interested in moving forward, is what are the chances of Jaden Greathouse moving around and not playing primarily slot this year? With Will Pauling coming in, I think that's someone who's had a lot of success as a slot receiver. So does that help Jaden Greathouse at all? Is he better at outside receiver or inside receiver? I'm not sure that I have a great answer for that, but that's something that I know I'm interested in seeing as we move forward.
Yeah, I think the wide receivers are going to be some of the most interesting portions of this team to watch in the spring for a lot of reasons, including who's not here. I think once you get past Jordan Faison, who's not going to be in spring, it's wide open. And so the rest of that group is going to be really interesting to watch. You have 2 really fast freshmen, one who really had a good senior year at wide receiver, and Elijah Burris. Mm-hmm. You have Cam Williams, who, I mean, from a raw talent standpoint, is as talented as any receiver on the roster. Now, as a finished product, he's not, and that's why he didn't play last year. But talent-wise, and then you have KK Smith, who has this top-end speed, but we haven't seen him be able to push his way up through the depth chart. When you were talking about slot receiver, Tyler, moving Jordan Faison back there, I think slot receiver is, unless you switch Will Pauling out of that, I think it's loaded. I think all 3 of those guys that you see on the depth chart there can play, and they can play now.
Right.
The boundary receiver's interesting because the guy that's probably going to be the starter, Malachi Fields, isn't here. Micah Gilbert had a really good spring and summer and then kind of faded in the fall a little bit. And that's because he was at that was a deep position last year. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily proven depth this year. So that's going to be an interesting, and see if, I thought Antavius Richardson or Scrap Richardson, I thought he might end up there, but if he's 6'1", 166, that's not a boundary receiver profile, or even somebody that had been listed at 6'2" as a recruit. So I'm curious if that was a typo or if he shrunk.
I know he had tall hair when I saw him in person. I don't remember what the top of his head height was, but he did have tall hair. Okay. I think the slot position this coming season could be even more important than maybe it was last year, because I think the tight end position may take a step back in terms of the depth that you have there and the wanton ability to play two tight ends. So I think there should be plenty of snaps to go around for the slot receivers and opportunities for Mike Denbrock to get creative there. All right. Speaking of the tight ends, they are on this next slide, which has our quarterbacks, our running backs, and the tight ends. Sticking with tight ends, I think it's a reminder of how thin Notre Dame's tight end depth chart is, especially this spring when you talk about Ty Washington and James Flanagan not being on campus for the spring, and then Cooper Flanagan being hurt and not having him available. So you basically have 3 scholarship healthy tight ends. And the top 2 at the top have had, unfortunately, a long history of injuries. So hopefully they can make it through the spring with an added workload for them this spring.
Well, Kevin Bauman coming back from our 6th year is a neat story, and what would be even a neater story is if he actually becomes healthy enough and gets enough of his game back, and whatever he did last year was a bonus. I think he was an inspiration to the team, but if they can get some utility out of him, both in the spring and then beyond spring, I mean, that would be great, because I mean, he came in as a guy that was in the same paragraph as Michael Mayer. He was in that same recruiting class. Not as talented as Michael, but certainly a guy that could have been a starter at a lot of places and just ran into some bad luck. It's going to be interesting what Jack Larson turns into. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts about Jack?
A bit undersized, a little slight. I'm curious to see like what he looks like with a year in the program and what sort of physical development he can make. I think he was more of a receiver than a tight end in high school, and so I think he had a lot of physical maturation that he needed to do. And how will he handle the added requirements in terms of blocking and stuff like that? I think he is a solid receiver, a guy that is good with a good route runner that can get open, not the fastest, not the biggest, but just sort of a smooth receiver. So I'd be curious to see what he looks like this spring, and if you could find maybe a role that maybe caters to his skill sets more in Mike Denbrock's offense. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were kind of going down with your voice, so I thought you were at the end.
Yeah, no, I was going to switch to one of the other positions, but if you have something else on the tight ends, I don't want to.
I do want to mention, I think Ty Washington and James Flanagan are big wild cards. Cooper Flanagan, I can't imagine him playing at all in 2025 because of when his injury occurred, an Achilles injury. I mean, if he came back at the end of 2025, wow, that would be quite a comeback. So we're talking really about the top 5 tight ends on this list. Ty Washington, who wasn't extremely productive at Arkansas, but I think there's something there, or Notre Dame wouldn't have taken him. And James Flanagan, when people say what freshman might be able to help right away, that's where my finger hits the keyboard is on that one. So, and then there's always, if somebody got hurt or somebody wasn't quite what they thought in the spring among Larson and Bauman, Notre Dame could certainly use the spring portal period to add to the position.
Yeah, and this is just a reminder of how deep Notre Dame's running back room is. I really like that room. Might be the deepest on the team right now. And then Jeff Stevens said, care to wade into the quarterback debate now. So we can talk a little bit about the quarterbacks. I think both Eric and I have the same opinion, so it might not be a spectacular debate, but I believe CJ Carr will end up being Notre Dame's starting quarterback. I think he is in position to do so. He has to go out and earn it, and obviously stay healthy after dealing with an elbow issue this past season. But I think he brings the highest ceiling to the group, and I think there's a good chance that ceiling begins to show this coming season for Notre Dame.
Right. I do think Angeli will take the first number 1 snaps. I think he's kind of earned that, but I think this is going to be a true quarterback competition, not the fake competition that it was, let's say, in 2012, and Andrew Hendricks told us this story on one of our podcasts, where when the media was in there, they had all 4 guys taking snaps in 2012. And when we weren't in there, Everett Golson was taking all the snaps. So I don't think it's going to be that way. I think we're going to see true 3, and then Blake Ebert will be kind of on the back burner, I think.
Yeah, and I think Steve Angeli has earned the right to be able to compete for that position and beat out CJ Carr if that's what comes of it. And I reported on the Insider Lounge this past weekend that he is due to get his degree at the end of May. Like, I think there's been thoughts about, okay, well, how long will Steve Angeli stay at Notre Dame if he's not the starting quarterback, and how would potentially graduating delay or speed up that decision? But but I've learned that he is on track to graduate at the end of spring. Now, I'm not saying that will play a role in his decision, but I think that
gives him more flexibility.
And I think a lot of guys that come to Notre Dame want to be Notre Dame graduates, and he'll have a chance to do that and would still have plenty of opportunity to try to play somewhere else if he pleased, or he could still continue to try to fight for a job here and maybe even win the job this season. And he could enjoy some time as a graduate student at Notre Dame in the future too. All right, let's go to our next group of positions, and that's the offensive line. It's a little bit more of a crowded chart here. This one's hard to do because there's so much movement in terms of guys could maybe move around. We tend to try to not repeat guys at different positions, but I think it's impossible at this point to not do so. And as you see there, Charles Jagusa as the projected starting left tackle to start the spring, Anthony Knapp as the starting right guard, and then Ashton Craig. We'll see where he's at in his recovery in terms of what he can do this spring, and then that maybe influences what the depth chart looks like in these spring practices.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't know that they're particularly married to Billy Schrouth being the left guard. He could be the right guard. I mean, he played the first part of the season at right guard, then moved to left guard when he came back into the lineup. I think it's just all kind of a comfort level thing. I remember talking to Charles Jagusa, and I talked to Joe Rudolph about this in Atlanta, and I said, what's more difficult, guard to tackle conversion or right and left? And both of them said right and left. And Charles said, it's because your footwork is all backwards. You know, you have to completely reverse your footwork. Your hands move a little bit different. He said, you know, inside and outside wasn't as big a deal for him. Now he's got the length to deal with being outside. But I thought that was interesting. So that's why I mentioned if Billy Schrouth is comfortable on the right side, he and Emil Wagner were a good team over there. They may want to keep Knapp and Charles Jagusa both on the left side, but we'll see how that plays out. And Ashton Craig, I mean, if he's not ready to go at the beginning of the season, you could see Knapp there. I don't think Joe Otting would be the number 2 center necessarily. I think you would go with somebody else. You'd move some pieces around to make sure you had your best 5 on the field. I don't think Joe Otting is in that category at this point.
Yeah, I'd like to see Knapp, and Michael Parks chimed in on that, saying Knapp should play center. I'd like to see Knapp get some reps at center this spring, and my guess is he will, because that is a position Notre Dame thought he could play when he came in as a freshman. And I think a lot of what plays out with this too will be Gerby Lambert, who we have listed as the number 2 right tackle, but he could be a legitimate competitor to be the starting left tackle if he really comes along and becomes as finished of a product as we think he will become eventually, because Gerby Lambert is a very talented player. It's just a matter of when he starts to reach that ceiling that is pretty obvious that he has.
Okay, speaking of ceilings, if you had to predict now who has the higher ceiling, Gerby Lambert or Will Black, who was a 5-star. Gerby Lambert was close to that status. Will Black is that status.
That's I think that's tough. I think, but Lambert, I don't know. I think I need to see Black in person first before I feel really confident in that. I have not seen Will Black in pads in person doing much of anything. But Lambert,
I've seen his headshot.
Yeah, Lambert's physically imposing size, I think, feels more.
And his dunk was pretty good.
Yeah. Lambert feels more like of a sure thing to me. I think Black could become a guard even. I mean, who knows? I think Lambert's more of an obvious tackle in my opinion. Okay. Black is less experienced in the football game, but he's made such big strides throughout his college career that makes you wonder, like, well, wow, what could he really start to tap into college? It's a tough question to answer. I think And I think
Gary
it's a
right
great,
now has 40 pounds on him, according to this. 30
right.
pounds on him, according to this.
And I think it's a great, certainly, problem for Notre Dame to have of, okay, which of these guys who may be 5-star recruits is better in the long term, because I think those are both very talented, and most programs would welcome those guys onto their team if they could have them.
Okay, before we move on to the next position group, I got a bunch of treasures during that trip back to the Tribune, including my press pass for the worst football game, the worst football experience I've ever had in my life, the Independence Bowl in 1993. But I wanted to read this really quick from Harry about offensive line play. He heard me on the radio talking about his salty language and so forth. So he sent me this when he was with the Bears. And he quotes George Patton, and this is what it says. It says, and this is Patton talking, "When I want my men to remember something important, to really make it stick, I give them double dirty. It may not sound nice to some bunch of little old ladies at an afternoon tea party, but it helps my soldiers to remember. You can't run an army without profanity, and it has to be eloquent profanity. An army without profanity couldn't fight its way out of a piss-soaked paper bag. As for types of comments I make, sometimes I just, by God, get carried away with my own eloquence." So that was from Harry Heastan, so I thought I'd share that with you.
All right. Yeah, I remember when you got that back at the Tribune, and that's funny that it was still around. All right, well, let's move on to the defensive line. I think you don't see it when you open the spring because you still have Jordan Botelho and Boubacar Traore coming back from injury. But one thing that stands out to me is that the Viper position has a real opportunity to be improved and a strength of the team. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, when all those bodies are healthy, and whether or not Dominic Kulak is ready to, even if Logan Thomas hasn't grown up yet into a defensive end body, there's a lot of potential there, especially how well Junior Tui Halamaka was playing at the end of the year. I think the one thing that he doesn't have that those at least three of the others have is that burst. But he was certainly playing very well and an ascending player toward the end of the year. But yeah, and it allows Josh Burnham to go back over to the field end, which strengthens that spot.
Yeah, and I think even like Logan Thomas, like that is someone I think who has a very high ceiling. We saw some flashes of that. I think Traore could be, if Traore becomes the best version of himself, I mean, he could end up being as high of a draft pick as anyone. I think he has that kind of special athleticism at the defensive end position and length that can be really solid. I think there's some interesting young players here that I don't know how much they'll play a role this season, but Christopher Burgess Jr. was highly recruited and evaluated coming in the incoming freshman class. He's not here in the spring, so we won't see him quite yet. Bryce Young's great. I think everyone thinks his future is bright. So I know folks, including Xander Cruz in our comments, is negative about the job Al Washington has done, but I think there are reasons to be optimistic about where this defensive line can go. I think there needs to be a continued improvement on the defensive line, but there has been some really good defensive linemen that Notre Dame has signed in the recent classes. When you talk about Burgess, you talk about Bryce Young, Logan Thomas, Boubacar Traore. I think all those guys are really good. Now, I think the bigger question now is like, okay, we need some defensive tackle help. Like, where's that coming from? And are the guys that Notre Dame signed recently going to make an impact there moving forward? I think there's reasons to question that. And obviously Notre Dame feels a little bit similar to that because that was one of the priorities of the transfer portal, at least for guys that could impact this year. They feel like they needed to bring guys in and even brought in a younger guy in Elijah Hughes. So are there any names in those interior positions that stick out to you as someone that could be names to watch?
I mean, there's certainly quantity there. I mean, you look and you say, my goodness, that's a fourth of the team is those two positions. And I'm exaggerating. My math isn't that bad, but it's a lot. I mean, 12 players at those two positions, but they need to get some quality out of them. I mean, Jason Anye, if that comeback is sustainable, I really like him in that mix. I think they wouldn't have brought in Jared Dawson if they didn't think he didn't have a higher ceiling than what he showed at Louisville, and he was a pretty good player there. Hughes is really interesting to me because he wouldn't make sense to add to this group if they didn't think he was a really high-end player, because there's too many guys like him already on the roster.
Right.
And so if they thought he was just going to get lost, why would you bring in – this is very rare for them to bring in a true – he's going to be a true junior. Now, again, this is a guy – it's hard to get credits to transfer, and yet – I mean, Hughes coming out of high school, in addition to USC and some of the traditional powers, had all the Ivy League schools looking at him. So I sense that he was taking pretty advanced courses at USC. I think the one that I'm most curious about that's near the bottom of the depth chart on what's going to happen is Brennan Vernon, just because of how highly he was thought of as a defensive end coming in.
Mm-hmm.
He's an interesting personality. He's been patient to this point. We knew that his body was changing last year and he wasn't going to get a lot of play, but this is a big spring for him. I mean, this is, if not now, when, not in terms of starting, but in terms of moving up. So how about you? Who intrigues you on the list?
Yeah, Vernon's interesting. The Hughes addition makes you wonder, it's like, okay, well, do they that would likely indicate that they feel like they need to get more options in here and that they're willing to lose some of these younger as a result of that. And so I think this position group seems primed to have transfers out after spring when folks get a sense of where they fit into the mix. But I think I'm not sure that many of these young guys are going to play significant roles. I think it would be nice, but I mean, if I had to guess, I think the best 5 options are still going to be Rubio, Onye, Heinisch, Dawson, and then maybe Mucom. I don't know that you're going to get much farther down. I like Sean Sevillano Jr. as someone that could be there. I think his opportunity is maybe somewhat dependent on, okay, well, are Rubio and Onye both defensive tackles? Are one of those guys move down to the nose guard position? What's the best use of that? And maybe that's dictated by who's the better third place guy at either position. Do you have a better number 3 as Armel Mucom at defensive tackle, or is Sean Sevillano Jr. a better 3 at nose guard? So I think there's lots of options there, but a lot of guys that you have more questions about than you have answers for. And so the focus will certainly be on that position in the spring and going into the season.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that Sevillano has, he and Davian Dixon, is it Davian or Davian? Davian. They have different body types. I mean, they're well over 300 pounds. They're more kind of the Lewis Nix body type. If they have the Lewis Nix ability, then that would be great, but they do have the body type.
All right, next up we have linebackers, a position that certainly showed its strength this past season. This is one where I don't know that the positions really matter that much, because I think there's going to be a lot of rotating, and there was a lot of rotating, and I expect that to be the same. Do you agree?
I agree, and it was hard to put people in certain places even based on the rotation. You know, it's like, okay, KVA isn't, a second tier guy, but I thought his best position is middle linebacker, and I think he and Drake will play together, which they did this year.
Right.
I think for me, of all the people in terms of where they fit, that I think is most interesting is Jalen Sneed and Jaden Osbury, because Notre Dame is using the Rover a lot less than they did when it was the Elko Clark Lee position, just because Notre Dame goes out and gets a nickel and you play nickel more than you play your base defense. So the rover's not on the field as much. And yet Jalen Sneed was able to carve a role by being all these different roles. He could be a rover. He could be an inside linebacker. He could be a pass rusher viper. He did a lot of different things. I'm curious, though, who is going to be the primary weak side linebacker. It could be KVA. So I think that's going to be interesting how these positions, even though there's a lot of versatility in the positions, who lines up where. And I do think Madden Faramo is going to be in that mix.
Yeah, there's a lot of talent there. I thought Sneed really progressed in the playoff. Like, I thought he played his best football of his career in the college football playoff. And so the hope would be that he could continue to build on that and become even more and more reliable, maybe settle into more of a position every down player. And does that help you, or does he need to be someone that plays different roles and moves around, and that's the best way to get the most out of him? I think that's something that Max Bola is continuing to find out, because
he is going to put on weight. I mean, that's his thought, is to get over 230. So he's going to be the size to play weak side linebacker.
Right.
That's where they primarily want him.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Jaden Osbury could end up playing there too. Like, even though we have him listed as a rover, he certainly could play weak side linebacker a lot. Faramo doesn't look like he needs much physical development from the moment he stepped on campus. And so there's a lot of good options there, and Kingston really showed up as a freshman as someone that could bring some things to Notre Dame's defense.
Were Madden and KVA friends before they both came to Notre Dame?
Yes, they were. I don't know exactly how tight they were, but they did have a relationship.
They look like they eat at the same dinner table because they're both strong. I mean, they came out pretty close to looking like finished college products.
Yeah. So plenty of talent there for Max Bola to work with this spring. Let's move to another talented position group for Notre Dame, and that's the defensive backs. Another one we got to squeeze a lot of positions.
And we are going to get to your guys' questions too. So
yes, yeah. So yeah, if you have more questions, feel free to keep them coming. We have some from early in the show, and if it's about the specific position, I've been trying to include them while we're talking about them. The defensive backs here. The interesting thing to me is, okay, who's the starting safety alongside Adon Schuler? I think that's the obvious one. Then the other thing is what other nickelback options does Notre Dame have beyond Devontae Smith? I think a couple of the freshmen, Mark Zachary and Dallas Golden, could be nickelback options sooner rather than later, if possible. So those were two things that stood out to me. Let's start with the safety first, Eric. How do you see this playing out? Do you think it'll be much different than what you have it lined up here as?
Of course, it's going to be different. It was last year when we thought Rod Hurd II was going to be that starter, and then Adon Schuler had other plans, but Rod Hurd was still really valuable. I think this is going to be a deeper safety group. I mean, Xavier Watts had almost 1,000 reps last year, 1,000 snaps. I don't think you'll see Adon at quite that high of a number, and certainly the other safety won't. Jalen Stroman is really interesting because there's a lot of projections about how good he can be when he's coming off an injury, when he's healthy. I moved some people around too. Tay Johnson could certainly play the field safety. I mean, when you think about like some of the best athletes on the team, somebody asked me, who I would have on a 4x100 team. Luke Talich was on my team. I mean, I realize it's Wyoming, but he won 4 state championships as a senior, and his times are really good. Tay Johnson is a breathtaking athlete. I think all the way down to Kennedy Urlacher at the boundary safety. And I don't think Ben Minnick's going to be in the mix, but I do think Jadon Blair could be.
Yep.
So, wow, that's going to be a fun competition. And as far as nickels, you're right. That I do think it's it's too bad that Zachary and Dallas Golden aren't here in the spring, because it'd be fun to get a look at them. And yet you think about the guys that have come in June, they just go on to be freshman All-Americans. Leonard Moore was a June enrollee. Ben Morrison was a June enrollee. So that may slow them as far as training them at the nickel. But yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's roles to be had in terms of the backup cornerbacks on the outside too, because
those guys, Gray and Moore, played all but one snap from the USC game on.
Right.
Every snap but one. That was it. And I think you do need a better rotation there.
Yeah, and so hopefully Carson Hobbs is in a better position to contribute this coming season than he was last year. I think there's reasons to believe that would be true. But yeah, I really like the cornerback recruiting class that they're bringing in with Cree Thomas, Dallas Golden, and Mark Zachary. That's arguably one of the better position groups that Notre Dame recruited this past cycle, and one of the best group of cornerbacks that Notre Dame has recruited in the Rivals era, spanning back to 2002. All right. I don't know that we want to spend a ton of time here unless there's anything that really stands out to you about the specialists. I wanted to include them. No real surprises here. Obviously, Eric Schmidt coming in to be a backup at potentially both the kicker and punter, and obviously Noah Burnett coming in as the grad transfer kicker from North Carolina. You still have the same snappers. Holder is a big question. Like we're guessing.
I guessed at that. I mean, he was the fake holder on fakes.
Yeah.
So, but he would be a good one to have as a holder because it makes fakes easier. Then you don't have to have somebody else wearing 26 to fool people.
Yeah. So,
I'd rather take questions than talk about the specialists.
Yeah. So we can do that, and I will close this out. But let me pitch you one of the questions before I start working on that. Justin ND Sniper says, if Carr wins the job, do we potentially lose Steve Angeli and Kenny Minchey? That seems like the worst case scenario to me.
Well, I think the worst case scenario would be naming somebody the starter and keeping everybody that doesn't deserve it. If Carr wins the job, I mean, we're in an era where if Minchey wins, you could lose the other two. If Angeli wins, you could lose the other two. I don't think that you will. I don't think that'll happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if one of the quarterbacks doesn't stay. And I think Notre Dame is in a decent position if just one leaves, because you could move Tyler Buckner back to quarterback if you needed to. And he played scout team quarterback for 2 weeks. And you have Anthony Rizak, who's Teddy Rizak's twin. And I think he's a good 4-string type of guy. So that would be my take. How about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you want it to be obvious that those guys don't have futures at Notre Dame. And I don't think that's how it's necessarily going to be handled this spring. But I certainly would not be surprised if one left. With 2 left, I think that would be a little bit more surprising. Because anyone could be one step away. And we're just talking about a CJ Carr who just missed a big chunk of last season with an elbow injury. So it's not like he's Iron Man and is going to be able to go through his first season of playing without having some issues or injuries. So I think it would probably be unwise for both of them to leave. But yeah, I mean, that would not be a good scenario if both of them left. I don't think they will both leave. Because I mean, Minchey then is getting closer to then maybe next spring he can graduate. I don't know where he's at on his path to getting a degree, but that would seemingly be possible. So then maybe he sticks here for another year, and then gives you a chance to make another decision next spring on what he wants to do. All right, Mike DeVoy says, linebacker positions seem incredibly deep. Do you see any of them moving to safety or field end or Viper?
I don't. But I mean, Preston Zinter maybe is a guy that could. But you look at the Viper position and you say, okay, do you want to move from linebacker and be the 6th string Viper? You know, Jalen Sneed was able to fill some of those pass rushing roles. So is Kingston Viliamu Awesome. Maybe Madden Faremo fits into that. But I do agree. I mean, it's if everybody comes back healthy, including Kahanu Kia, there's a lot of linebackers when you're playing primarily two of them. You're not playing three of them more downs than not. And then where are they going to go at safety too? You move them out of being the third or fourth string linebacker to being the fifth or sixth safety. I mean, it's a great problem to have, and it's a really good question, Mike. But I just don't think there's a real natural fit for any of them to move to another position.
Yeah, I think Zinter is the one that is the most interesting to me as a potential guy to move. I don't see enough athleticism for many of those guys that would be able to play safety. And so I think if you're going to move, anyone were to move, they would move down to a defensive end position. So I think Zinter could potentially do that. I mean, long term, maybe Madden Framo gets there. But I think I think you believe he's so talented at linebacker that wouldn't be something that you would want or need to do. But especially when you're talking about young guys, they could have all kinds of growth that could change what they end up looking like in a couple of years. All right, Bob Oxnard says last year Riley Leonard missing spring appeared to delay passing game progress. How long can we divide quarterback reps by 3 without unduly delaying progress by Miami?
Well, I mean, Riley Leonard wasn't able to do anything or very much once he was injured. You know, he couldn't really work on the timing with receivers and do things. So I think these guys will be progressing. They'll be forming chemistry with the receivers. Obviously, nobody's going to be able to do it with Malachi until he comes in June. So I think spring is a good time to have your competition. And then I think certainly by training camp, you would be down to 2 at that point. And again, I don't think it's going to be a problem because you're not missing. You're still doing that. You're still healthy in the summer and able to work with the guys in the summer. So I don't see it as being a problem.
Yeah, and you're not starting from scratch either. These guys have been in the offense and in the system,
Right.
So that helps you.
With the same offensive coordinator.
Same offensive coordinator, same quarterbacks coach. So I think the concerns shouldn't be the same in terms of inability for them to have enough experience in practice to progress the offense. Now they'll all have their own concerns depending on who ends up being the starter in terms of what they can or can't do or haven't done. But I don't know that it would necessarily be as a result of having to split reps in the spring. All right, Scott Fegan asks, hey guys, how would you rate the wide receiver group compared to the spring of 24? Also, do you feel the secondary will be as good with the loss of Watts and Morrison, or will they struggle?
Okay, let's start for me. I'm going to start with the second part of the question first, and then we'll do these separately. So do you feel the secondary will be as good with the lots of Watts and Morrison, or will they struggle? I don't think it's one or those other alternatives. That I don't think they're going to struggle. Now, to what point will they be as good or better? You will miss Watts. They've already been without Morrison for more than half a season, so they're already used to not playing with him.
Right.
And I think the cornerbacks are going to be really good. I think that this could be a secondary. I think Notre Dame could be in the mix to win a third straight pass efficiency defense, depending on what the pass rush looks like in the front. But I don't think anybody's going to be as good as Watts was last year. But I do think the corners are going to be better, and I think Adon Schuler is going to be better, and I think the safety group is going to be deeper. But I do think they'll miss Watts. Did I answer that, or did I?
Yeah, no, I think no, you definitely answered that. I think I could see a world where Schuler is as good as Watts in 2023. Now, maybe he doesn't have as many interceptions because you can't. that those sometimes are just happenstance. Like you just are in the right place at the right time. Not that that's the type of player Xavier Watts is, but you sort of have to get a little bit lucky to be in the right place to make that many interceptions. But I do think Adon Schuler could have a very good year. It would be hard for him to be as good as Xavier Watts was last year. I would say I would agree with you there. And like you said, the Morrison loss, they've figured that out. It's a matter of being able to have depth at cornerback. So you have options beyond Moore and Gray. And then I think it's important.
I think Devontae Smith and Jordan Clark. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that was where I was going next. I think because Notre Dame has had so much success with nickelback transfers, you sort of assume a certain level of competency there. But Devontae Smith has to go out and do it. He could also be better than Jordan Clark too, though. That doesn't mean that Jordan Clark is the absolute best was the best nickelback in the country last year, because I don't think that would necessarily be true. And so maybe Devontae Smith even elevates that position this coming season. Or maybe they find different ways to play to his strengths that are different than Jordan Clark's, and they use him in different ways too. So
I think Devontae Smith was better at Alabama than Jordan Clark was at Arizona State, but
yeah,
Jordan had some injuries there, and we'll see if that ascension continues for Devontae.
Yeah, and it'll be an important season for Christian Gray to bounce back. Someone just mentioned that in the chat. Outbound, appreciate that outbound. That Christian Gray's got to rebound from some of his struggles from last season. You're never going to fully eradicate struggles as a cornerback like that. That's going to happen from time to time. But I think Christian Gray is a better cornerback than maybe he showed at times during the end of last season. But then even within some of those games, he showed how good of a cornerback he can be. So more consistency would probably be a big goal for Christian Gray this coming season.
And then how about the front end of that question? I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I would say if we're talking about spring to spring, because Malachi Fields isn't here, I don't know that it's that significant of an improvement. Although you didn't have Bo Collins in the spring last year either. But I do think overall this wide receiver group has the potential to be better. I like Malachi Fields a lot. I think Will Pauling is intriguing as a slot receiver. We finally saw Jaden Greathouse start to come around as a breakout player at the end of the playoff. I think you know what you're going to get from a healthy Jordan Faison. And then you're looking for some other guys to step up, whether it's Micah Gilbert, whether it's a Logan Saldate, whether it's Cam Williams, KK Smith. I think there's some intriguing options there. So I like where it's headed. I still think it's a big question mark, but I think there are understandable answers to some of those questions if everything starts moving in the right direction.
I'll keep my answer pretty succinct because Tyler covered it well. I think the three sophomores are really going to figure into how we end up answering that question ultimately. Cam Williams, Logan Saldate, and Micah Gilbert. I think they're all really talented. Are they ready for that step up to compete to be in that rotation?
All right, a question here that I don't think we have an answer for, but I'll throw it in anyways. ND Sailor says, what amount of NIL is being paid by position and team level, first or second?
Okay, Andy Saylor, what's going to happen after April 7th most likely is Notre Dame will make direct payments rather than it being NIL. And then NIL is going to be a separate thing on top of that. And we don't know what Notre Dame's plan is. I don't think that they want that out there. So we would be guessing. If you've seen it somewhere on the internet, those people are guessing it as well. So, and it's not going to be the same from one team to the next. It's not going to be the same from 1 year to the next. There's years that Notre Dame is going to want to spend more money in the transfer portal. There's years that maybe they need that money near the end of a recruiting cycle to help break the tie somewhere. And so it's not going to be as scientific as it is with the NFL, where all that stuff is generally known. And again, year to year, it's going to change.
Yeah, and I think it's important to add, like, Notre Dame just hired a general manager who has not even been officially announced as the general manager yet. So Mike Martin will have some say in how that all is going to play out too, and what the future of the roster management and payments will become. So,
and to be honest with you, it's part that I'm least forward looking toward reporting on.
Yeah.
That's why I'm in a college sports, because I don't like the salary cap. I could care less. Now what I do care about is how the money affects team chemistry, how it affects those things. But in terms of who gets what, I know they're all making more than me. So
all right. Scott Fegan says, with the new defensive coordinator, do you see Freeman engaging more on defense than he did with Golden?
In the spring, yes. Ultimately, I think he hired somebody that he thinks can, that he's confident that can run the defense. But I think Marcus is always going to have ideas. We see him in practice sometimes with the linebackers. It seemed like he was present with the defensive backs a little bit more, just given the fact that how much Mike Mickens, how many, he has two eyes and he has two position groups. And I mean, that's the thing about football, is I think it's best when it's collaborative. And I think, why wouldn't you want Marcus having some ideas? And yet again, I think Coach Ash he'll be able to be masterful in running the defense with or without Marcus's help. It's just like, why wouldn't you want great ideas from a guy like Marcus?
Yeah, I would imagine like Marcus's biggest role and most important role will be in terms of like making sure that transition is smooth from Al Golden to Chris Ash, and he can help with that. So early in the spring, the summer, even into camp, I think it would make sense for Marcus Freeman to be more involved in the defense in those stages. But I don't know that it's like gonna overly consume him and make him a worse head coach by any means, in terms of like the amount of time he would need to spend in helping things along with the defense.
And remember, Chris Ash has the remaining staff as the same, so you're not bringing a whole new defensive staff.
There was one more question from Scott. Will the running backs get more involved in the pass game since the tight end group may drop off from previous years?
I think they may get more involved in the passing game regardless of that. I know that last year we saw Jeremiah Love taking a lot of reps as a slot receiver. I just think Mike Denbrock's going to move in that direction and use them in the passing game a little bit more, just because they're really good at it. And you got, who isn't among those top three good at receiver? Aeneas Williams was a really good receiver. Jadarian Price, we saw him maybe more as in that spring as a freshman, but we know that he has that in his game. So I could see that whether the tight ends emerge or not, surprise us.
Yeah, I think that makes sense a lot, and I think could be a safety blanket for whoever's becoming the new starter at quarterback to have some running backs you can check the ball down to and make some plays will be important as well. All right. I think we've exhausted most of the questions that I've seen. Let's get on to we've talked plenty about the depth chart, so I don't know that I want to do some of the questions I had prepared for us on the depth chart. I can go through some recruiting stuff real quick.
Okay.
I wanted to mention that we have reported over on InsideIndySports.com a handful of 2026 recruits in the last week have scheduled official visits to Notre Dame for June. So make sure you're following along on the Insider Lounge for those updates. The latest was today, 4-star defensive tackle Noah Clark out of North Carolina. He has an official visit scheduled to Duke, South Carolina, Virginia Tech, and NC State in addition to Notre Dame. 4-star defensive end Drake Quinn, who Notre Dame offered somewhat recently, 6'4", 220 pounds, out of the Atlanta area. 4 stars, number 95 overall in the 2026 class, according to Rivals. He also has official visits scheduled to Clemson, Georgia, and Tennessee. He's also planning to try to get it to Notre Dame in March for an unofficial visit. A very intriguing edge prospect and an exciting one if Notre Dame can be a serious contender there. I've heard some feedback that Notre Dame has some optimism that it can really be a contender in his recruitment. Offensive tackle Ikene Ogboko is a 4-star recruit, the younger brother of Nnamdi, who was an offensive, or I think a defensive line recruit that Notre Dame tried to flip from Georgia unsuccessfully, but Ikene visited back for the Ohio State game in 2023 when his older brother did. So this would be his first trip back. He also has official visits scheduled to Clemson, Georgia, and Alabama. He's a 4-star recruit ranked number 130 overall, according to Rivals, 6'6", 290, if I didn't say that yet. And then his teammate is a defensive end that Notre Dame really likes, 6'4", 210 pounds, Ebenezer Iwatade, out of South Garner High School in North Carolina is the school that their teammates at. Ebenezer is number 195 overall, according to Rivals. And they both have the same official visit schedule. And Ebenezer was actually on campus in January for Junior Day, and that's when he received his Notre Dame offer. The last one is Xavier Larice, out of Melbourne, Florida, 5'10", 180, a defensive back, 4 stars, number 250 overall. He also has official visits scheduled to Auburn, Oregon, and Florida State. We'll have more information on those guys as they get closer to the recruitments and more information over on the Insider Lounge. But I wanted to at least highlight those for you guys as things that we've been discussing over there. A couple other items on quarterback recruiting. Noah Grubbs, Notre Dame's quarterback commit in the 2026 class, was named quarterback MVP at the Under Armour Next Camp in Orlando on Sunday. And then Trey Taylor, who Rivals ranks as the number 13 overall prospect in the 2027 class, he's planning to return to Notre Dame on March 18th. He's yet to receive a Notre Dame offer, but maybe that changes on March 17th, which is St. Patrick's Day and also Notre Dame's Pot of Gold Day. He's visited Notre Dame a lot, so he's plenty familiar with Notre Dame. Notre Dame didn't make his top 5 because it hasn't offered yet, but he's hoping to make a decision in June. So if Notre Dame wants to get in the running for Taylor, it needs to make up its mind on whether it wants to go ahead and offer him or not. He plans to visit Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, Nebraska, Texas A&M, and LSU all in March. So a busy March for him. And tease something I'm working on. I mentioned it over on the Insider Lounge this past weekend, a story for subscribers. That's the position by position breakdown on which recruits I think are the most likely to commit to Notre Dame's 2026 class at this point. So go check that out if you're interested. None of them that were my top choices have committed anywhere since I've released that list. But a second guess, Simote Katawanga, which I could be very badly butchering that name, a defensive end out of California, committed to USC over the weekend, someone that Notre Dame had been chasing for quite some time. But
we'll let the USC people butcher his name now.
Yeah, so that's on their laps in terms of what they want to do. All right, some more news and notes. Jaden Mickey, we learned last week he originally had signed to transfer to California. The former Notre Dame cornerback, he's since been released from that agreement and signed with Boise State. That means that Mickey will have a chance to play against his former teammates in Notre Dame Stadium this October. What do you think of that added storyline to the Boise State game, Eric?
I think as long as Ashton Genty isn't coming with him, I think that's a sigh of relief. I mean, Jaden Mickey, it's not like he's like, I'll show them. I think he probably needed a change of scenery. He had a lot of tragedy in his life. And we all know why he did transfer. Initially we're like, well, why would you transfer? Ben Morrison's probably going to go to the NFL. You could be a starter next year. And then Leonard Moore came along and we saw why, he didn't see a certain future at Notre Dame. But I think it'll be a fun game. Boise will be talented enough. But again, I think he's beloved by his former teammates. That'll be more of a reunion than a grudge match.
And we've talked about Texas's interest in Notre Dame defensive backs coach Mike Mickens previously, and I said that we need to see everything play out with the New Orleans Saints before we take a deep breath. And sure enough, Terry Joseph, who was Texas's secondaries coach, took a job with the New Orleans Saints. So we will see if Texas tries to pursue Mike Mickens for that opening. Texas previously hired Mark Orphy from Rutgers when the staff needed a safeties coach. I think there was some talk about Orphy was going to end up coaching cornerbacks. Now, I don't know if that's just because of what they prefer to do with Joseph still on staff. So I'm not sure what to make of this. Do you think Notre Dame should still be concerned, Eric?
I think anytime a team with a big pocketbook like Texas is interested in one of your coaches, you need to at least have your guard up. And it's a really good situation at Texas. I mean, they had a very good defense. They were number 2 in pass efficiency defense. Notre Dame was number 1. And yet I think the timing is bad for Mike Mickens. We're 3 weeks away from the start of spring practice at Notre Dame. I'm not sure when Texas is starting. They may start earlier.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't seem like an ideal situation. And he will, if Notre Dame's defensive backfield is as good this year as I think they're going to be, he's going to get even better offers next year and probably as to be a defensive coordinator somewhere.
All right. A couple other things coming up this week. The NFL Scouting Combine begins with media interviews starting on Wednesday for players and workouts starting Thursday. I'll be down in Indianapolis to cover some of Notre Dame's draft prospects. And then we're also expected to speak to new Notre Dame defensive coordinator Chris Ash, and running backs coach Jaywan Sider this week. So keep an eye out for coverage on that from Eric.
I'm happy to provide it for you. And we might have a little bit more surprises. And of course, big week for women's basketball, which I'm covering. I did have to take down my Christmas tree. My grandkids made me keep it up if Notre Dame made it to the national championship in football, which they did. Then it transferred to the women's basketball team. And until they lost, I had to keep the tree up. So it came down today.
So you didn't waste any time as soon as they lost.
I took it down today.
Were you taking down bulbs while Neil was doing the post-game conference? Or what?
My tree, if you could see my tree, it came down in a minute. It's a one of those fiber optic trees, so it's pretty easy and it's pretty small. It's in a closet now.
One last question here from Scott. Scott's been great with the questions tonight. Thank you, Scott. Notre Dame has a much tougher schedule next year. What games would you consider the most difficult?
Off the top of my head, boy, that beginning of it, I mean, Miami, Texas A&M will be difficult. Boise will always be difficult. You know, Navy is in some of the way too early top 25s. USC is always going to be interesting. I'm trying to think off the top of my head without cheating on looking at the schedule. But there were like 4 or 5 teams in the way too early top 25s, and not necessarily the teams that you would think would be in there. But yeah, I think it's going to be a challenging schedule. And of course they'll start playing it, and different teams will be the tougher teams as often happens.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so Miami to start the season, Texas A&M. At least you have a bye week between those. That is helpful, although that's not necessarily the best timed bye week for the length of the schedule, but the way those 2 games line up, I think it does help. Arkansas hasn't been the greatest of late, but to go down to Arkansas, I wouldn't chalk that up as an automatic victory, especially when we're talking about Notre Dame potentially having a first-time starting quarterback this year. Boise State, I don't know how much of a challenge that is going to end up being, but they're better than some of these MAC teams that Notre Dame has been playing in recent years for certain. I think USC could be game coming into Notre Dame in October. But then I think the schedule really lightens up on the back end. I don't know that there's a huge challenge there after that USC game. You got Boston College, Navy, Pittsburgh, Syracuse, and Stanford.
Syracuse had a good year. I know they don't have McCord anymore, but
right,
it'll be interesting to see what they come up at quarterback and if they can keep it going, because they were a pretty good team at the end of the year, Syracuse.
Sure. Yeah. I think the quarterback question mark is something that would certainly need to be addressed, because they were the beneficiaries of Ohio State feeling like it needed to upgrade at quarterback last offseason. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us tonight here on Football Never Sleeps. We appreciate everyone tuning in. If you're watching on replay, we appreciate you as well. Send us some comments or questions after the show, and we'll try to go back through and answer them if we get a chance to. Like we mentioned earlier, subscribe to us here on Inside ND Sports YouTube's channel. That allows us that allows you to see all of our content coming up, and we will keep this Football Never Sleeps train moving on a weekly basis throughout the offseason, because like the title says, football never does sleep. There's always something to talk about when it comes to Notre Dame football. And then if you're not a subscriber to us over at InsideNDSports.com, you can use promo code NDYT to get a 30-day free trial. And there's a link to subscribe in the video description below.
We should be back in the Monday time slot for a few weeks, but once women's basketball tournament gets going, I may have some Mondays where I have to work, so we'll bump it to Tuesday. In those cases.
Yeah, and Eric, Jaden Mickey is still working to graduate. He'll graduate in May, so that would be why he would be on campus. And you can't finish a degree at Notre Dame virtually. So just like Bo Collins and Rod Hurd finished up at Northwestern and Clemson last year, Jaden Mickey's working to still get his degree at Notre Dame, and so he has not transferred yet, but he will transfer coming this summer. All right, that's it. Everyone have a good week. We will see you next week.